They promoted the guy I trained. The guy who once asked me if a report needed punctuation. That's when I stopped waiting for justice. The day they announced Darren's promotion, the break room looked like a birthday party thrown by people who hated each other. Store-bought cupcakes, half-fake applause, a few congrats murmured with all the energy of a funeral. I just stood in the back. No clapping, no smile. Just watching the man I spent 3 years cleaning up after get handed my job. They gave him a laminated certificate, a card signed by the team. Julie, the director, hugged him. There were actual tears from Amanda, our team lead, like she'd just watched her kid win state. And Darren? He wore that slick little smirk like it was tailored for him. All teeth and ego. Wow, he said. Totally didn't expect this. Then he winked at me. Winked. But let me rewind, just enough to explain how he got here. 6 years. That's how long I'd been at Castor Tech. I was there when it was one floor in a shared office park with a duct-taped espresso machine. I stuck through reorgs, layoffs, new leadership, and the transition to remote. Never once dropped the ball. Then 3 years ago, Darren showed up. Fresh out of some innovative leadership program, whatever that meant. Looked like he'd stepped out of a LinkedIn ad. Sharp suits, flawless hair, loud voice, not a single drop of humility. I was assigned to train him during his onboarding, and within 3 days I knew exactly what he was. The kind of guy who coasted on charisma and made his messes look like someone else's fault. He didn't read policy manuals, I wrote them. He couldn't finish a compliance report without asking me which sections mattered. I even caught him Googling, what is an internal audit? But Darren? He played the politics game like a pro. It started small. He forgot to CC me on client emails. He'd throw me under the bus in meetings. Oh, I assumed Tom already handled that, or I would have included that data, but Tom said it wasn't relevant. Once, a report I wrote got flagged by a vendor for errors. I looked at the final version. It had been changed without my knowledge, by Darren. When I brought it up, Julie just shrugged and said, let's not dwell on blame. Right. Blame is a dirty word around here. Meanwhile, Darren kept rising. Started scheduling side meetings with directors. Got invited to off-site planning sessions I didn't even know about. At happy hours, I overheard him calling me Tom the Dinosaur to the interns. Said I was slow, stubborn, stuck in 2005. I didn't say anything. I thought maybe I was being paranoid. Then came the job posting. Senior Compliance Strategist. New role. Big raise. Direct access to the executive team. The kind of position you wait your whole career to earn. If you're the quiet, nose-down type like me. I applied immediately. So did Darren. Now, I knew my record. Clean. Thorough. Multiple successful audits under my belt. I'd created the framework Darren was using to do his job halfway. I was the obvious choice. But during the interviews, something felt off. The questions were fluffy. How do you define success? What's your leadership style? Nothing technical. Nothing about case handling or vendor accountability. Meanwhile, Darren was in there talking about compliance as culture and building bridges between risk and innovation. At one point, I was told I came across as a little too rigid. That maybe the department needed someone more dynamic. And then, the announcement. That awful break room. The cupcakes. Julie's bright smile as she said, we're excited to move into the future with Darren leading our compliance strategy. He brings a fresh vision we really believe in. There it was. Fresh vision. Corporate code for, he makes us feel cool in meetings. Afterward, Julie pulled me aside. Tom, she said, I know this is disappointing, but you've always been such a solid team player. I really hope you'll continue to support Darren in this next chapter. I said nothing. Then Darren walked up, shook my hand like I was his retirement gift. No hard feelings, right? He said. I mean, you basically laid the groundwork for this role. I'm just lucky I get to build on it. I nodded, still silent. Inside, I felt something break. Not explode, break. Like a crack in glass you don't notice at first, until suddenly the whole thing shattered. That night, I stayed late. Not out of habit. I needed to be alone. I walked past Darren's empty desk, spotless, of course, like he didn't actually work, and sat down in my cubicle. No one was around. Just the low hum of the HVAC, the faint scent of bleach from the cleaning crew. I looked at the calendar on my wall, still showing last month's dates, and thought about the years I'd given this place. The late nights, the quiet sacrifices, the things I'd kept to myself. And then I remembered something. something Darren had let slip in a conversation a few months ago. A comment I'd filed away and almost forgotten. And suddenly, I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused, but I didn't slam a drawer or call HR. I didn't storm into Julie's office with receipts. I just went home. The next morning, I brought donuts for the team. Smiled when people congratulated Darren. I even sent him a LinkedIn endorsement for strategic thinking. I said nothing. I stayed in my lane. Let him shine. But quietly, I paid attention. Because here's the thing about working in compliance. You notice what people don't report. And eventually, so does HR. Darren had been in the new role for exactly 4 days when he asked me to redo his risk matrix. I just want to make sure the visuals are super clear, he said, handing me back the same spreadsheet I'd already polished. I looked at it. Nothing was wrong with the visuals. But Darren didn't speak spreadsheet. He spoke optics. Sure, I said. I'll take care of it. He smiled like we were on the same team. Like I was still his fallback guy. And maybe in his mind, I was. I made the changes. But I also slipped one thing in, a color code swap between medium risk and low risk vendors. Barely noticeable, unless you actually read the legend. Something someone like Darren would absolutely miss if he was just pasting it into a board deck. Then I saved a clean version for myself. Timestamped. With original formatting. Call it insurance. Or curiosity. Darren submitted the edited matrix 2 days later. In the all-hands meeting, he called it a new approach to vendor segmentation. Julie nodded like he'd invented it. I said nothing. Afterward, I passed by his desk and casually asked, "Hey, you updated the risk legend too, right?" His face twitched. Yeah. I glanced at it. Of course he hadn't. He never looked closely at anything. But someone else would. Eventually, I kept playing the part. Took longer lunches. Answered emails just late enough to be forgettable. When Darren asked for help on something, I helped. Thoroughly. Carefully. But never too quickly. And when Amanda made a small mistake in a report Darren was supposed to review, I watched as he threw her under the bus in front of Julie. I trusted Amanda to catch that, he said, hands raised like he was disappointed but powerless. We're still ironing out some process issues. Amanda looked stunned. She started to speak, but Julie had already moved on. Later, Amanda came to me. Quietly. Was that my fault? She asked. I pulled up the audit trail. Showed her that Darren had approved the final version without even opening the embedded attachment. She stared at the screen. You going to say something? She asked. I shook my head. Wouldn't matter coming from me. She didn't press. Just nodded slowly and walked away. Another crack. Another note in the back of my mind. Then there was the intern situation. Castor Tech brings in 3 or 4 interns every summer. It's mostly resume padding, but occasionally we get a good one. This year we had a sharp, quiet kid named Lucas, Jr. at Carnegie Mellon, interested in data privacy law. One afternoon, I found Lucas sitting at the picnic table behind the building, looking like someone had just kicked his dog. You all right? I asked. He hesitated, then said, It's stupid. Darren just kind of implied I might not get a letter of recommendation if I keep correcting him in meetings. I wasn't even trying to. He asked something about GDPR, and I mentioned a new clause that passed in the EU last month. I didn't react. Just said, that clause did pass. I know, Lucas said, looking down. He told me to stop being a compliance Wikipedia. That was it. Darren wasn't just a clown. He was a manipulator. The kind who'd sour a kid's shot at grad school because he couldn't handle being corrected. I told Lucas to keep his notes organized and back up all his work. If anyone questions your contribution, I said, just point to the record. That seemed to help. A little. At home, my wife asked me again if I was going to apply elsewhere. Doesn't seem worth it, I said, stirring sugar into my coffee. You're not happy. I don't need to be happy, I said. I just need to finish what I started. She looked at me a moment. Tom, what are you doing? Nothing, I said. And technically, that was still true. Darren continued his parade. Called everything a cross-functional innovation. Talked about stakeholder synergy. Spent more time prepping decks than understanding the content inside them. One day in the elevator, he leaned over and said, I'm thinking about pitching a rebrand of our compliance framework. Something snappier. Maybe Zero Risk Plus or Trust Track. What do you think? I looked at him and said, sounds marketable. He grinned. Exactly. He really believed he was bulletproof. That confidence was going to be his downfall, not me. The micro-escalation came during a weekly policy review. Darren was leading, if you could call it that, reading off bullet points and nodding like he'd written them himself. Halfway through, I raised my hand. Just to clarify, I said, you mentioned vendor rotation protocol. Did we update clause 3.1.2 after the audit? Darren blinked. Yeah, we're looking into that. It's a yes or no, I said, still calm. Because the clause as written conflicts with the procurement policy Julie signed off on last month. He fumbled. Well, we can sync offline and Julie cut in. Let's review that today. Can you send me the docs, Tom? Already in your inbox, I said. She nodded. Thanks. I turned back to my notes like it was nothing. Darren smiled, but it was tight. That wasn't revenge. That was a stress test. Just enough to show the room he wasn't as buttoned up as he looked. Just enough to see who took note. That week, I made a quiet move. I searched for a few policy review files in the shared drive. When I found a misdated approval doc, one that Darren had clearly backdated to cover a vendor's early onboarding, I sent it to myself. Just the PDF. Nothing else. Saved it in a private folder, labeled with the day I'd found it. Again, not illegal. Not even against company policy, strictly speaking. But in the right context, that one PDF would be radioactive. I didn't tell anyone. Didn't even hint. I just kept showing up. Kept typing. And waited for the moment when everything would start tipping. Because it always does. That month, Darren's slip-ups stopped looking like one-offs and started feeling like a trend. He misclassified vendors in the new compliance matrix. He copied and pasted outdated regulations into an internal newsletter. He sent a department-wide Slack message touting Trust Track as the future of compliance, and someone replied with a clown emoji. He didn't respond. Probably didn't know how. I didn't correct anything. I didn't offer suggestions. I didn't speak up. For the first time in years, I let everything run exactly as Darren touched it. I wasn't his net anymore. And when you remove the net from someone who thinks they're tightrope walking well, the audit meeting was the first real shift. Not just for him, for everyone. The lead auditor wasn't someone you could charm. Darren tried anyway. Opened with a joke. Called the new framework, lean, agile, and future forward. She looked at him like she was waiting for him to stop talking. Then she asked a basic question. Clause 4.3.2. Can you walk me through how this aligns with your updated vendor segmentation logic? Darren blinked, then smiled a little too big. So we've actually taken a more fluid approach to risk posture. It's not locked to rigid clauses anymore. The auditor didn't move. When did you formally deprecate that clause? We're reviewing the transition now. I watched Julie look down at her notepad. Amanda glanced at me. I said nothing. It was quiet for just long enough to feel wrong. We moved on, but the room never recovered. Darren started rushing through his slides, reading bullet points like they were a script he hadn't rehearsed. He skipped slide 13 entirely. When the auditors left, they didn't say much. Just thanked us and promised to follow up. That would have been enough to rattle most people. But Darren doubled down. The next morning, he sent a team-wide email titled, "Great work yesterday," for paragraphs about innovation and progress. Not one mention of the clause he couldn't explain. Then, a few hours later, he replied to Amanda's team's comment on vendor policy alignment and wrote, "Let's not overcomplicate things. Legal isn't losing sleep over this." Unfortunately for him, legal was in the thread. One of the junior attorneys replied within 5 minutes. Actually, we'd flagged this inconsistency last quarter, looping in Priya from compliance legal now to confirm alignment. I watched Darren's status go offline right after that. An hour later, I walked past Lucas's desk. He looked nervous. "Everything all right?" I asked. He nodded too quickly. "Just trying to stay out of it." He'd been smart to stay quiet after the Slack joke. I never told him who forwarded me the screenshot, and I didn't need to. He'd already saved it himself. "He's not mad at you," I said. "He's mad people are noticing." Lucas didn't answer. He just went back to his screen. Julie stopped me by the elevators later that day. Nothing formal. Just a quiet check-in. If I were to ask for a full document history on the last vendor review, would that be straightforward? "It would be complete," I said. "And time-stamped." She nodded. "Thanks." That was all. But her voice had changed. Not curious, measured, like she was testing her footing before a step. What came next wasn't planned by me, but I didn't mind it. Amanda spoke up in the Thursday team sync. Darren had just breezed past the procurement alignment slide when she asked, evenly, "Sorry, just to confirm, Did you incorporate the new clause from legal's update into this version? Darren hesitated. It's on the roadmap. Amanda didn't blink. Because the live version on SharePoint still reflects the old language, and procurement flagged the mismatch yesterday. Darren tried to recover. Said he'd circle back. Julie looked at Amanda, then back at Darren. Let's review the source version before this goes out. I could feel it happen in real time. A shift. Darren wasn't the loudest voice in the room anymore. He was explaining himself, and no one was rescuing him. That night, I opened a document I'd archived months ago, the policy draft Darren had asked me to pretty up before the promotion. I hadn't. I'd saved it as is. His version had an unapproved section included, written in language that clearly contradicted vendor contract guidelines. I checked the document history. He'd copied it into 3 presentations since then, submitted it twice. I didn't send it anywhere. I just flagged it, quietly, so I could find it again later. The next morning, Darren called me into his office. First time he'd done that in weeks. He didn't offer a chair, just stood behind his desk like we were in a movie. I need you to go through the vendor records again. Apparently there's confusion about versioning. I looked at him. Confusion from who? Procurement. Legal. Julie. Doesn't matter. I just need it cleaned up. I nodded. Of course. He exhaled. Relaxed, like he thought we were on the same side again. I left without another word. That afternoon, I sent Julie a brief note. Nothing dramatic. Just a list of version numbers, file names, and 1 sentence. Here's the audit trail as it currently exists. No commentary. No accusation. Later that evening, I walked past Amanda's desk and said quietly, "Keep your emails organized. This might be a busy quarter." She looked at me for a second, unsure how to respond. Should I be worried? No, but he should be. She didn't ask what I meant. By Friday, the tension in the office had thickened. People kept their heads down. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of the next Slack thread. Darren was still smiling, but it looked strained now. He was still calling meetings, still sending out summaries, still pretending he was running the room. And maybe he thought he was. But I'd seen this pattern before, just not from his side of it. He thought I was still helping him. He was about to find out what I'd really been doing. The audit report arrived on a Monday morning. Not with fanfare, not with sirens. Just an email quietly sitting in everyone's inbox, marked with the usual corporate subject line. Q3 External Compliance Summary, for review. But by noon, you could feel the temperature change in the office. Conversations slowed. Side eyes became more frequent. Darren's name was on page 2, twice. Not directly, but close enough for anyone familiar with our org chart to connect the dots. The language was neutral but undeniable. Inconsistencies between documented policies and actual implementation. Ambiguities in leadership roles and approval authority. Failure to align vendor classification with declared risk protocol. Julie didn't forward it with commentary. She printed it. Hard copy. Brought it into the Tuesday sync, set it on the table, and said we'd be going through each item line by line. Darren sat across from her, pen in hand, posture tight, smile tighter. I didn't bring anything but a notebook and sat quietly at the end of the table. She started from the top and worked her way down. By the 3rd item, it was clear she wasn't skimming. She was auditing the audit. This risk matrix on page 4, when was it last approved? She asked. Darren flipped through papers. That version was finalized sometime last quarter. I'll confirm the exact date. Julie didn't look away. You don't know the date of your own matrix? Before he could answer, Amanda spoke. It was June 9th. I submitted it after vendor review with legal. Julie turned to her. Thank you. That moment hung in the room a little longer than necessary. Darren didn't respond. Just adjusted the cuff of his sleeve and moved to the next slide. But something cracked in his voice. A hairline fracture. The real moment came 20 minutes later. Julie, still calm, asked Darren to explain the rationale behind skipping clause 4.3.2 in the updated vendor framework. He started spinning, talking about agility, adaptive strategy, cross-departmental feedback loops. She let him finish, then turned to legal's rep sitting at the back of the room and asked, "Do we have documentation of this adaptation being approved?" The woman didn't miss a beat. "No. We flagged the omission last month. Never received a revision." Julie nodded, looked back at Darren, and said, "Then it wasn't approved. Let's call that what it is." It was quiet after that. Not awkward silence. Just clarity. When the meeting ended, no one moved at first. Amanda gathered her papers calmly. Lucas closed his laptop and left without saying a word. I waited until the room was almost empty before walking out. Darren stayed seated. Julie didn't look back at him. The next morning, Darren's name was missing from a project update email that he would normally send. Julie sent it instead. Amanda was listed as the point of contact. By noon, Darren had scheduled one-on-ones with both of them, back to back. The blinds on Julie's office were drawn. When Amanda came out of hers, she looked directly at me as she walked past and gave a slow, tired exhale. She didn't say anything. Later that afternoon, I passed Lucas near the break room. He looked pale. I asked him if everything was okay. HR talked to me, he said. Asked if I ever felt pressured not to speak up or intimidated by leadership. I raised an eyebrow. You tell them the truth? He gave a nervous smile. I told them Darren once said feedback is only helpful when it's filtered through experience. I don't think they liked that. I told him to keep a record of the meeting. He already had. Thursday morning, an all-hands calendar invite came from Julie's office, titled Compliance Realignment, Process Ownership Transition. No explanation. No agenda. Darren wasn't in the office that day. He worked remotely. He'd stopped making eye contact with most people the day before. The meeting was brief, clinical. Julie stood in front of the projector and said the department would be undergoing a structural reassessment. Effective immediately, she would be assuming interim oversight of the compliance strategy process. Amanda would lead documentation consolidation. All ongoing policy adjustments would go through legal first. Darren's name wasn't mentioned once. There were no thanks, no acknowledgments, no slide bearing his title. Just a deletion, done in silence and witnessed by the entire floor. After the meeting, people stayed in their seats longer than they needed to. A few traded glances. One or two whispered. Lucas looked stunned. Amanda didn't. She looked ready. I walked past her desk as I left the room. She was already updating folder permissions. That afternoon, Darren came in late. No tie, no smoothie, just a stiff walk and red eyes. I passed him in the hallway. He glanced at me, then looked away. Not like he was avoiding me. Like he was searching for something that wasn't there. Friday morning, Julie called him into her office again. This time, she left the door open. Midway through the conversation, her voice carried down the hallway. Calm, but direct. You approve documents with outdated clauses under your credentials. That's not a debate. A few people looked up. No one said anything. Darren exited the office 15 minutes later, face blank, mouth drawn tight. On his way back to his desk, he passed Amanda and stopped. You're really enjoying this, huh? He said, low enough that I could only catch half of it. Amanda didn't even look up. I'm just doing the work you ignored. Darren stood there for a moment, waiting for something. He didn't get it. He turned, and then he saw me. He stopped. You've been setting this up, he said, not loud, but enough for both Amanda and Claire to hear it. Haven't you? I looked at him. I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. I just tilted my head slightly and said, you might want to check the metadata next time. His face changed, just for a second. Then he walked away without another word. By the end of the day, his name had been removed from the compliance strategy folder on SharePoint. His access was restricted to read-only. He wasn't copied on any end-of-week reports. And when Julie sent out the quarterly leadership update, his name appeared only once, in a bullet point about organizational realignment. He still had a job. He still had a desk. But he didn't have a role anymore. And what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the job was only the first thing I was taking. The rest of it, that was next. I never sent a tip, never made an accusation, never even raised my voice. All I did was stop fixing his mess. That was it. I let his mistakes be his. Let the system he thought he was gaming work exactly as designed, without the buffer I'd always quietly provided. No tampering, no setup, just time, patience, and records he never thought anyone would check. The first actual ripple hit when procurement flagged a vendor contract for inconsistent clause structure. That was their polite way of saying it looked like someone had backdated a version that never went through legal. It traced back to Darren, of course. His name on the submission. His timestamp on the upload. But it wasn't just that one contract. There were 6. All submitted within 2 weeks of his promotion. All full of the same inconsistencies. Legal reviewed the files and looped in HR. HR called it a compliance integrity review, but I already knew what it was. A polite, thorough dismantling. 2 days later, legal reached out to me. not for a complaint, just for clarification. They wanted to confirm the approval trail on the older vendor documents I'd submitted the previous quarter. I gave them everything. Not a summary, full originals, folder structure, and the metadata history showing when and where each document had been reviewed and by whom. I didn't editorialize. I didn't suggest what it meant. I just gave them the truth. The shift inside the office was immediate. Julie stopped copying Darren on strategic memos. Amanda began fielding senior review requests. Lucas told me that HR had pulled him in and asked whether he'd ever felt pressured to soften language when interacting with leadership. He told the truth. Said yes. He said Darren once told him not to nitpick things that only matter to policy nerds. HR wrote that down. I didn't have to prompt him. Darren had done that part all by himself. A week later, Julie asked me to present at the upcoming compliance leadership panel. It was internal, but executive level. Historically, Darren's role. I accepted without asking questions. The day before the panel, I came into the office early. Darren wasn't at his desk, but the drawers were open. His nameplate was gone. The chair was pushed in. Nothing dramatic, no scene, no announcement. Just absence. Clean. Empty. I already knew what happened. He hadn't been fired, not technically. They'd offered him an off-ramp. Resign quietly. Retain your title on paper. Keep your severance, but leave now. He took it. Not out of guilt. He didn't have the capacity for that, but because he could feel what was coming, and he wanted to preserve what little illusion of control he had left. But it wasn't over. Because the meeting, the one I was invited to replace him at, was scheduled in the same conference room where he'd first announced his new role. I remembered it clearly. Cupcakes. Cheap applause. Him standing at the front with that laminated certificate and the fake look of humility he never quite pulled off. I walked into the room that day, same tie I wore then. Just for me. Julie introduced me as the person whose work defined the standard we're now returning to. A short sentence, cleanly delivered. But it landed. Everyone knew what it meant. I gave my remarks, precise, nothing flashy. Just the facts. What had gone wrong. How we'd restructured the process. What clarity and ownership looked like when you actually understood what the job was for. No slides. No slogans. Just substance. When I finished, the room stayed quiet for a few seconds too long. Then came a round of applause. Not polite, not over the top. Just solid. Real. Enough. As I sat down, Julie turned to Amanda and said, "That's why it should have been his job from the start." Darren wasn't there to hear it. But I was. And so was everyone else. Later that afternoon, as I passed through the downstairs lobby, I saw him, Darren, standing outside the glass entryway, talking to someone over the phone, dressed in business casual with a rolled-up resume folder in his hand. He didn't see me, or maybe he did and chose not to look. Either way, I kept walking, quietly. The next day, a man from records asked if I had access to Darren's old folder structure. I told him no. It had been deactivated. He said, "Good," then added, "Your stuff's been clean as hell through all this. Julie said you're the reason the ship stayed afloat." I nodded. Said, "Just doing my job." But that wasn't the whole truth. There was one final moment. The only moment where I let anything personal show. The last time Darren and I ever spoke, 2 days before his quiet departure. He stopped me in the hallway, eyes bloodshot, voice low. "You really couldn't let it go, could you?" And I could have ignored him. Could have smiled and walked past. But I didn't. I said, "You took credit for my work. You used my name to look competent. And you thought I'd keep letting it happen because I wouldn't fight you." He said nothing. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "That's what I couldn't let go." Then I walked away. No threats. No grand exit. Just the truth, delivered plainly. He didn't try to follow me. Didn't say another word. That was the last I saw of him until the lobby. He thought silence meant safety. He thought inaction meant weakness. He thought disappearing into the background meant I'd forgotten. What he never understood was that I wasn't quiet because I was scared. I was quiet because I was letting him walk further and further into his own mess without ever realizing someone else had stopped cleaning it up. He built his rise on my work. And I let him. Just long enough to make sure the fall was his alone.